Excellent. Okay. Before we get things started, how many people are in a security role today? A little bit. How many people have a dedicated security team they work with on projects? Few groups. How many people have a dedicated BA as part of those security groups that you work with to help ensure that your project has the right security requirements? Okay, so the first question was a little bit of a trick question, and it's why I'm so glad you're here today, which is all of you are in a security role, whether you realize it or not. Because security, fraud, risk has to be taken into account in the projects, because when you find it out at the end, it's too late. So we're going to go through a few things, and with anything, especially security related, we get to start with some fun disclaimers. So the first of which is, hold on. Okay. Sorry. Printout does not match the presentation, so we'll do it this way. So stay connected while you're here. You're going to see, do we have any people tweeting? Okay, a little bit of tweeting. So at Project Summit is diversified communications handle for these events. Don't forget PSBAWATL is the hashtag for this event. Also, if you didn't know, business analysis on Twitter, PM on project management on Twitter are two universal hashtags. So if you ever want to see what people are talking about related to business analysis or project management, those are great handles. So that's my Twitter account, so feel free to tweet during it. And it's also at the bottom of the screen if you forget along the way, because it's easy to mess up. Okay, now the fun disclaimers. Didn't mean to delay. So, unless otherwise stated on the slide, almost all of the stats that I'm using come from the Verizon Data Breach Investigation Report. This is a publicly available report. It is one of the most awesome, funny to read, and possibly terrifying reports you can get every year. They do an amazing job with the report, but it is a little nerve-wracking to read what else is going on. I am solely responsible for the content of this presentation based on industry information. So this information does not represent anything that is done at SunTrust, represent SunTrust policies, or have anything to do with SunTrust whatsoever. Also, absolutely none of this data or information has anything to do with SunTrust or comes from SunTrust. So there is no client-specific information in any of this. However, welcome. This session's for you, so I want you to ask questions. I want you to participate as we go along. This is going to be kind of an information-heavy presentation, more so than I like to do usually, but it's really important and I want people to get a flavor for it. This is really intended to give you a high-level view. I wanted to subtitle this, "This is everything I didn't know until I actually managed the security services delivery team and had to implement software and started learning terms and things that I just didn't even know exist." And I was like, why did nobody ever teach me? And I was like, I'm that somebody, so please take this, share this with your friends. The video will be posted on my YouTube channel. The presentation's available. You've got the guide, which is the presentation in readable form. Feel free to download and distribute that anywhere, reuse. If you need an editable copy to steal, yeah, go ahead, grab it. If anyone needs it, grab it during the middle. We're very informal here. Also, absolutely no animals were harmed during the creation of this or any of my presentations, but I do encourage you to support your pet rescue groups. So to start off, I want to share a little video that kind of gives you a context of why this may be so important. Yeah, I don't know why I'm not getting video. Alright. I got no audio coming up here. Hold on a second.
Want me to get the guy?
No, it's my laptop. I don't. Alright, we're going to do this without audio, and I will figure your outline's not working later. And I will talk you through. So this is the link to the YouTube available, but basically what they did was they set up a tent with a fake fortune teller to highlight Dave, who is going to be on a new TV show. And they invited people in off of the street to try and guess information. So he's predicting and reading information from their past. I apologize for losing the audio. So here he's reading back people's account numbers, their identification numbers, past transactions, shopping habits. And this is information that people don't even realize. They're having to take their own cards out. And then in the big reveal, they have a number of people pulling information off of publicly available sites, sites that have information for sale, and people's social media postings. So everything that he came up with was relatively easy to get online. And this is from a bank that was wanting its clients to be a little bit more vigilant. Phenomenal introduction to security. So why do we care? Why does it matter whether or not we understand this? Anyone want to hazard a guess? Or cheat and read off the slide? Rosie?
Because data breaches are hugely expensive.
Okay, it's huge expensive. Does anybody here believe, and you're behind the camera so nobody will be able to see or there's no recording, how many people here believe that their company has not been breached? You are all correct. Everyone's company has been breached at some point or caused a breach or leaked information that we'll go into. So when we're working on projects, when we're working with business areas, this is our first opportunity. If we don't do it now, the cost of finding it out later, either because there's a breach or even discovering it later, can be astronomical. So you're really saving countless hours of rework. So you have to be the advocate. So just like we're the advocate and the translator for business needs, security, fraud, records management are business needs. So we talked about having security groups. How many people have a records management team they work with? And if it's part of your security team, you can count that too. Okay, so only 2 out of the entire room. That's an organizational gap. That's a gap that you're going to have to fill in and find out how to do it. So these requirements are just as important as any other business need, as any other thing that's driving business functionality. So let's look at some of the top 10 breaches that we've had. So as you take a look at it, and this information gets updated every year, the number 1 still is 130 million records. You've heard Social Security office was hacked, and those records are coming out. So taking a look at, these are just the number of records that were stolen or leaked or that were part of a breach. Now, we had a new one, let's see, 2 years ago, which was a Sony breach, which wasn't stealing information as we commonly know it, account numbers, transactions, things like that. They were breached with internal secrets, release dates, and then blackmailed to pull movies, to change programming, or it was going to be released. So what information do you have access to, the people that exist in your company that could be used against it? So let's talk about an anonymous company that has a bullseye logo who had one of our more recent breaches. So what's really interesting about this is I think this tells a great lesson of how saying it's not my problem or my responsibility or realizing can stretch so far. So between November 27th and December 18th, they started to discover that there was a problem. So it takes a while to understand and know that you've got an issue. How did this happen? So it happened through a phishing attack, but it wasn't a phishing attack of Target. One of their vendors, an HVAC company who services stores, had an employee who clicked on an email, launched a phishing attack, which then started recording everything, all the desktop it was a keystroke logger based on Zeus. And so the type of attack or the problem is in brackets for each of these. And that was Psbaw Mechanical. Well, they, like many companies, use Ariba for spend management and invoicing. So the credentials, when they logged in to submit an invoice, was then used by the hackers to breach Target's defenses because it was a valid AD account. Makes sense? So then, once they got inside the network, they started exploiting vulnerabilities in any Windows servers they could find on the network because they weren't adequately patched. And they did that through SQL injections. They finally got a RAM Trojan. So basically, when you think about it, when you swipe your credit card, it reads the account number, and you know that all that information is encrypted, right? It's encrypted by the software, but it has to be in the computer's memory before it can be encrypted. This, every few seconds, scrapes the memory, records everything that's in active memory before it's been encrypted, stores it, and then sends it out. The total cost to date for this breach is $252 million. The only thing they're facing that's approaching this cost is their escapades into Canada, but that's a completely different subject. So think about this. How many people ever thought that you'd need to defend your software system from Ariba? I mean, who would have ever thought of it? I mean, when you're designing it, you're figuring your users, your access, but what about all the other users that are on the network? Are you preventing them from getting in? So here's what happens when we don't take action. A few quick facts. Right now, 80% of our breaches are for external. So if we're talking about external, that's the 80%. For some of the internal ones, the percentage will be of just that 20%. Phishing emails. 23% of people open the phishing emails, 11% are still clicking through on them, and 50% of that happens within the first hour. So by the time your company realizes you're under phishing attack, half of your exploits have already happened. Half of your customers, half of your users have already been infected, unless you happen to be stopping whatever version of attack. 99.9% of published vulnerabilities are still in effect a year later. This means if I came to each one of your houses and showed you that you had a water leak, and told you that it's leaking water and is going to damage your house or apartment, and I come back 1 year, 0.1% of you would have fixed that leak. Everybody else would have soggy walls, rot, bugs, everything falling apart. This is what we're doing in security. Published vulnerabilities are not getting fixed. Now, we aren't going to be able to fix all of those, but this is why making a sturdy system is so important. What about mobile? That's the big fear. Well, really, mobile is really attacked by anything that attacks the web, so it's more web-based, mobile web. But when you talk about actually devices, only 0.03% of devices are getting infected each day. So right now, that's still extremely low and almost negligible if you talk about Apple devices. Think about your system. And so as we're going through here, think about what you're working on. Think about one of your last projects. For every 1,000 records, not 1,000 users, 1,000 records, 1,000 transactions, 1,000 pieces of data, the cost for a breach is estimated between $50,000 and $87,000 per 1,000 records. You have 1 million transactions that leak, what's that going to cost the company when it happens? Ask Target. And in Target's defense, Home Depot got hit with the same type of attack, and it took them 6 months to find it. The FBI actually notified them after finding the target breach and said, hey, do you have these symptoms? And then they found the RAM scraper on their credit processing systems. Well, what do we talk? 55% of internal incidents were privilege abuse. So the 20% that's internal, half of those were because people had advanced access to secure data. Of that, 30% of the incidents were people sending secure information to the wrong people, whether it's internally or externally. So you're trying to send an email to Dave in accounting, and instead you send it to Dave in Guadalajara. 17% published non-public data on public web servers. And not necessarily web servers, but when you talk about any file share, FTP, it's very easy to do. And 12% were due to insecure disposal of personal or medical data. So simply not taking care of records and recycling them, shredding them, putting them in secure bins, depending on what you have. And probably, I don't know how many of you even have secure recycle bins. So what we're going to talk about here is basically how you drill down. We don't have infinite time, infinite resources, so we can't solve anything. So you've got to kind of pick your battles. So the first thing is, what are the tiers of security? How do we look at this? So the first thing is, I've got to prevent unauthorized access. So if you wanted to guarantee 100% safe systems, all you would have to do is turn them off. Prevent anybody from using them, and then you wouldn't have anything to worry about. But we know that isn't happening. So the first thing you need to do is stop everybody from getting in, but then just allow those people that are authorized. Second, once someone's authorized to use a system, to use a network, you've got to control that access and activity. Limit them to only the things that they're allowed to do. Along with that, you need to monitor everything that's happening, everything that's being done, so that if you find issues, you can resolve them. So again, as I'm going through, please stop me as there's questions.
You know, a lot of times, management can raise issues, but if you don't know the code, you don't know what that program is put in there that will allow a backdoor.
Absolutely.
If you're not technical, how do you know that this backdoor exists unless you have some idea? And sometimes there's backdoors in the code that the programmers don't even know.
Right. For our standpoint, there's really no good solution. So you can try negative testing for things that you may know, or to test the boundaries, to test your requirements, but when it comes to bad security practices, there's really nothing we're going to be able to do. It's going to take a security professional, peer reviews will help, code reviews, having architect, coming up with processes like that can reduce those chances. Working with your tech lead and saying, hey, we're developing this in .NET. I want you to spend an hour with the team and talk about all the most common .NET vulnerabilities and make sure those aren't hitting us. Things like that. But in a lot of cases, yeah, we're a little bit powerless.
Well, and let me just say this, Hans, there was a payroll company said that you cannot access the payroll information unless you're within the building. So I had a little bit of knowledge about it. I went home, I put in my ID, bam, I'm in the system.
Yep.
But they tell me that I'm good.
Yeah, that's a great example of negative testing.
Yeah.
So by working with your test team and creating those test cases, but around security and access, trying to do things that you know you're not supposed to do, finding users that are outside of your system's user group, and testing is a great way of doing it.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
We would do a security review before any application goes live. The group that's focused on security has to review that and say, yep, you're good to go.
And that's awesome. And there's two ways I've seen groups like that operate. If they are working off a checklist where they say, here's our standard requirements and did you meet these? That's just like the surface level. If they really know what they're doing, then they are looking for backdoors. They are looking for, they're testing SQL injections. They're looking at access models. They're looking for patch levels. That should be part of everyone's release management process. The smaller the company, the less likely that is to happen. The more agile you are, the less likely it is to happen because nobody wants to do that rigor every single time. The more regulated you are, finance, healthcare, not government, they aren't really doing a good job at much of anything. The more likely you are going to see things like this. Okay? So there's really, for this discussion, there's 5 key areas that I want to highlight. First, identity access management, IAM for short. This is basically about managing who's who and what are they allowed to do. Records management, how do we keep track of the records we care about and make sure they're being retained? And fraud. So I'll be covering all 3 of those in detail. Network and physical. When we think of security, we're normally thinking of network, firewalls, encryption, servers, patches. Most of us aren't going to touch those things. If you want to write it into your non-functional requirements saying all servers will be patched to the current enterprise release, all encryption will be 256-bit per our standards, you can go ahead and put those in, but for the most part, those are going to be handled by your infrastructure and engineering teams. There's not a lot of work we're going to do on the project, especially on the requirement side for those. So identity access management. Really, it breaks into 2 key areas, identity and access. So the first thing is, we've got users. And who is that user, and what is their identity within your system? If you're talking about employees, they have access to multiple systems. Their identity might be different in each of those systems. And then once you verify their identity, you have to map that to their access or their permissions. What is it they're allowed to do? How are they allowed to do it? So when we talk about identity, the first thing you're going to hear is coarse-grained entitlements. Coarse-grained is the way of identifying that who the user is in your system, verifying the identity. And there's really 2 methods we typically use. Challenge response, most common, username and password. I'm asking you for something. If you supply what I'm looking for, I let you in. And then we're going to spend a little more time and talk about adaptive authentication, which is the future, and where we need to move all of our systems to. When we get into access, we're talking about fine-grained entitlements. So if anybody does any woodworking, you start with rough sandpaper that has a very coarse grit, and then when you get down, the closer you get, you do fine-grained, fine sandpaper to finish it off. So there's really 2 places you can manage fine-grained entitlements. One is you centralize them all into one place, and this isn't AD. AD is an example of coarse-grained entitlements because AD doesn't tell you what you can do in the system, it just tells you who's who. Or you can do distributed within each application. There is no right answer here. Some software, some areas have a very robust security model built into it. It would be silly to rebuild that in an external system. But if you have a centralized system, it's easier to manage. So taking a look at adaptive authentication, really this is a risk-based approach. So where we are most familiar with this is think about your credit cards. Originally, when we had credit cards, you walked up and if you swiped it, you were good to go. Whoever held the card had unlimited access to use the card. And then as more cards got stolen, we had to say, okay, that's not enough. I need to start monitoring your spending habits to see if buying that $5,000 TV is really something that you're likely to have done, and if not, I'm going to make you call and verify the transaction. That's gotten much more sophisticated. If you want to run an experiment in a new area, swipe your card at the gas station, charge $3 of gas, and then try and make another purchase, especially a large electronics purchase. You will get flagged for fraud. The reason being, when people steal cards, the best place to test them is a gas station. Pop it into the pump a little bit, you see if the card gets declined or not, you drive off if it is and nobody notices. If it's still valid, you know the person hasn't reported it and now you can go and try and spend. So that's one of the little fraud tricks that people have been doing. So the more dangerous the activity, the more access, the more you're able to do. For example, if I want to see my account balances or my credit card statement, does it really matter if someone calls in and knows your account number and finds out what you owe? Not really. I mean, it doesn't really hurt you. It's not great, but it doesn't hurt you. If you want to do a balance transfer, that's big. So you'd want to step up the authentication and find other ways of verifying. So some examples. IP blocking. If you're using a system or have a company that only operates within a certain country, you can block out IP addresses for the rest of the world. Blocks out anyone who's traveling, and it doesn't handle proxy servers, but at least it will stop Eastern Europe, Russia, China, and all the hack attempts that come from there right off the bat. What about geo-blocking or geolocation? All of our mobile devices and even our web browsers are in tune with our location. It can be spoofed, but for the most part, is it likely that that device that a customer or an employee is using is in that location? And if so, you can add that and say, okay, I think that they're trusted. Trusted device. We're probably most familiar with this when you log in and it says, I log in from this device a lot, don't ask me again. That's a common thing. So if it's logging in may pass the step. Biometric are becoming really popular with fingerprints, facial recognition. The way you shake a cell phone is unique. You can actually, there's a company that has a shake method that instead of having to log in, you shake your phone and it develops a shake pattern just for you and can let you in. Now that would be coarse grain, and then you would want to step up if they started moving money or getting to secure information. Tokens, time-based keys, these used to be the little like RSA keychain codes that people had if you're old enough. And now there's apps, Google Authenticator, there's a lot of apps that will run through there, and it generates recycling keys. A great way of doing it. Temporary keys, text someone, send it to their email, phone. So a previously trusted device. You don't want to do this from an untrusted device, or if I find one of your phones and then I can call in and set my phone as the text number to use it to get into your phone, that's not so cool. And then user-defined factors. This helps with phishing attacks. If they create an image or a question or a response, then they're more likely to know that they're on your site and not someone else's site. CAPTCHA is kind of common. That's just a way of somewhat easily protecting from automated attacks against your system. Although the more I keep using this, the more I'm starting to think I must be a machine because I keep missing it. So I'm not really sure of my own identity anymore. Third-party identities. Anybody here use a third-party identity? Allow your customers or your employees to log into an account using a Facebook account, a Google account, an Apple account. It's worth considering, because if you think about it from a coarse grain, do we really care? As long as we know that you are you, does it really matter where that identity is coming from? And in some cases, by creating completely separated, you're now forcing somebody to hack two systems to get into yours. But you want to make sure that coarse grain, again, step-up authentication based on risk, has to be done, should be done on your own systems. Questions? Okay. So when we're talking about identity, one of the challenges we have is, how do we know who Bob is? And who's Bob in each system? Bob may be Bob in other systems, but how do I know if it's Bob Sponge, or Bob and Paul, or Bob and Ginny? I don't know. So I actually know of a company that has struggled and cannot launch an integrated portal. They've been working on it for 10 years because they're having such trouble finding out which Bobs are which Bobs. And think about this, let's use healthcare as an example. If you have a spouse or partner and you have shared healthcare, are you allowed to see their other person's medical records? Exactly. Don't know. I mean, maybe, maybe not. Those are the decisions. What is common information versus separate information? What if somebody says, we want to authorize it so my spouse can see? You have a question?
Yeah, there was a question. There was a situation where I was trying to get my brother to fly. He didn't have his ID. He was ill, and we didn't have his ID. And I was his, like his carrier or whatever. Yep. But they said, "Give us a moment." They went somewhere. They came back with all these questions. Where did he live 15 years ago?
Yep.
What house did he buy? What color was his car? I mean, they had all kinds of questions that only,
yes.
I'm like, where did they get all of the information about him? And I guess they would have it for any of us.
Yep.
Somewhere.
Anyone want to answer or take a guess where that comes from?
From that video?
From the video, no. No, this is a legitimate source. It's one of their biggest money makers. Where's that data coming from?
Facebook.
Credit.
Credit Bureau. Yep. So Equifax is one of the biggest ones. So if you're applying for an account online, our banking regulations state that you have to know your customer. So you have to identify information that only that customer could know. So Equifax and other companies provide a service that goes through your entire credit history, your public information, everything they have stored about you, and then asks you questions, and with trick questions there, like none of the payment is none of the above,
Right.
to identify, to say, if you can answer these, you know enough about this person that you're probably legitimate. So that's an example of a two-factor authentication. And one of the reasons it can be challenging is if you have access for credit reporting, you can pull up your credit report and then quickly look, or you can look up those records. So it may be time consuming, but you can do it. And the thought is that meets enough of a threshold based on the risk from before that it's okay to move forward, that if you have access to that, you probably should have access to everything else. Yep. So that's another advantage for people that are doing credit monitoring. Credit monitoring will at least give you that information so you can quickly pull it up online and see it when you're filling out that information. It also tells you and gives you alerts when something hits, but that's also too late to do anything about it. The only way you can protect yourself is putting a credit freeze in place. I'm not going to go into that here because this is more about being a BA, but if you go to clarkhoward.com and type in credit freeze, he's got great instructions, and I've done it myself. It's very easy to do, very easy to use, and it can save you. So when you're talking about entitlement management, this can drive people insane. So think about this. You may be developing a system that stands alone, but what happens when it needs to connect with other systems? What if it's an internal system and it needs to talk? It ends up greatly increasing the complexity. So, I apologize profusely if you see any of your passwords up here, but these are, once again, this was the 2014 most common password. I haven't, 2015 list I haven't found yet. And so one of the challenges we have is that our email, our social media, and our real accounts, we tend to use the same passwords. So, if you look at this, even if you got into a system or got someone's email address, you could probably get in if it didn't time or lock you out with one of these. So this is why, thinking personally, you got to consider the more times you make someone change their password, the more likely they are to use something that's really, really easy to remember. And personally, if you can come up with something that's a pattern, something that cycles, adding in something like a time-based element, like a year, a variable. You can come up with the same pattern, but then customize it for each site, each account. Or you can use one of the many password savers that'll actually generate very complex passwords. And all you do is you log into your password reminder, it says copy, and it's a one-time paste. It doesn't even paste into memory. My favorite one was Let Me In, not to be confused with the vampire movie. Okay, so entitlement requirements, what happens? So when we're talking about our access, we got to know where does this go wrong. So what is somebody allowed to view, modify, or delete? Also add, modify, delete is also common. But deletion kind of stands alone. So when you're thinking about it, don't always assume that delete is one of the biggest rabbit holes you'll ever run down. Is deletes, soft deletes, it drives programmers crazy. We'll talk a little bit about that. Embedded groups and inherited permissions. It might be very easy to just say, okay, if this is a group and they have the ability to read, if I include the group of people who have write access, if you can write, you should be able to read, right? Well, it makes sense. But where is that write group coming from? Is that a global write group? Is that a group that only a portion of? What happens if somebody adds another group into there? So it's very easy to get embedded groups, especially in AD, because they're so easy to create. And then you can create loops, and you can bypass all of your security. Assuming requirements or constraints that aren't adequately documented. So there's a translation that happens when people look at the system, and if you haven't adequately documented, you have no idea what it's going to turn out. There's two really big phrases that you'll want to learn and want to start using. The first is segregation of duties. In a nutshell, this means I shouldn't be able to do two things that are contradictory or bypass each other. In a developer's world, if I'm writing code, I should never be allowed to deploy code. Or I can bypass and I can put whatever code I want into production, especially if I know I'm going to get riffed. You do not want to have that. User groups, permissions. Is the same person who's creating an invoice allowed to pay the invoice? Is allowed to change the address? May seem, you've got an accounting department of one, why can't they do all of that? Well, the reason is because one of the common type of fraud is called address changeback. I go into a system and find a vendor. I change their address to my address or a P.O. box. I issue a payment to them. I then change the address back, so if anyone looks at the system, the vendor's address is perfect. And then I issue the check and I can go cash it, and I'm off with the money. So advanced fraud systems actually look for address change events, anomalies like that. So the other is least privileged access. This means giving your people the absolute minimum amount of access needed to perform their jobs. This will drive developers crazy. This will drive some of your system users crazy. Everybody wants full admin access. They want to be able to do anything because they don't want to have to go to someone else. They don't want to have to wait on someone else. And when the time comes, they don't want to have to put in a system for permissions. That will haunt you. That's how mistakes happen. When you talk about accidentally sending out all the voter records in Georgia, that's how it happened. They got an instruction that said, prepare this and send this to the people. Person had access to, they had developer access, so they just put it on a CD, mailed it out as they were told, and now all that information that shouldn't have been released was released, but the person who did it may or may not have known that that wasn't correct. So again, 55% of the incidents was privilege abuse, people having more access or using that advanced access. And 40% of the time, they were doing it for personal financial gain. Not necessarily fraud, not necessarily direct theft from the company, but selling records on the black market or selling records to people. You'll hear about people at businesses getting caught with an app, it's basically like Square, where they'll skim your credit card as you go through a drive-through line. They're selling those numbers. They're never going to use those numbers. They're never going to ring a charge. They're just selling them, and they're getting 10 cents, 50 cents, $1 per number that then gets resold. So one of the most frightening things that's changed in the security landscape is it's not that if I was a hacker, I don't care about getting your information so I can get into your bank account. I could do that, but I have to somehow breach each one of you and then get away with that theft. And that takes a lot of time. What the core hackers are doing now is, I'm going to find the conference website and the conference payment, and I'm going to hack them, and I'm going to get everybody's information at the conference. And then I'm going to post and sell that to as many people as I can for a smaller amount of money, but it's at almost no risk to me, other than the initial hack. And then other people are going to buy that, and then start trying to use your credit information elsewhere. So that's where the big change is breaching companies, breaching governments, solely because the information has value. And if you don't think information has value, how many people pay for their Facebook account? We heard it this morning from Eric. We're exchanging our private, privileged information so that we don't have to pay for that service. So that has extreme value to them. Multi-billion-dollar company because of it. Well, that's the same way that hackers look at most companies. So let's shift for a second and talk about records management. So when we talk about a record, that is a piece of information. You need to be concerned with changes to that record, versioning, and changes is different than versioning here. A change is anything that happens to edit, change, delete, modify, versus versioning, which is actually tracking that change. Retention, how long do you retain? The storage, and the transport of that. So a lot of times we think we're doing the right thing, and we might not realize it. So updates and versioning. This has to be tied to fine-grained entitlements. So anytime you're modifying a record, that has to be tied into your fine-grained security model. Do you care who or how that data was changed? Are you looking for it to be changed with a certain account? Because then if somebody's changing it in a database or changing it through a system command, that might alert you that something's not right. Do you care if it was updated? How are the different versions going to be used? How many versions do you need to keep? A lot of the information we think, you use it, you change it, and it doesn't matter. What happens if you have to go back and do you need forensic accounting? Do you need to be able to go back and rebuild what happened at a certain point in time? Now you can see how the magnitude of record storage complexity starts to increase. Encryption, we have a false sense of security with. It's absolutely necessary, but it only works if that data is outside your system. If you think about it, and a system's using encrypted data, isn't it decrypting it to use the encrypted data? So if you do a command, if you hack through a legitimate user or through a legitimate system, it knows how to decrypt those keys. It needs to include seeding. So this is a non-functional requirement you can add in. Seeding means you either take the information and add in additional characters or additional information, or you encrypt it and then add additional information. So your systems know how to take the seed out and then decrypt it. The reason that that's valuable is, remember the password list? I don't have to know your encryption method. I know the top 25 passwords. I just have to look for the most common ones, and then I can reverse the encryption and then use that to at least get those accounts, if not figure out what encryption key you're using, and then back it out that way. And that's where it can be bypassed by repetitive data. So the more times you're encrypting the same information, the easier it is to figure out what that value is. Storage. Is the data going to be used more by outside applications? How many people work or have data that goes to a business intelligence system or a data warehouse or work on it? All right, most people. Did you implement the same security in the data warehouse that existed in your system?
Different group, don't know.
Exactly, different group. Okay, so why was certain data secure and restricted in one system, but not if you call it a data warehouse and a reporting warehouse? There was a system that I worked on that actually had an amazing and robust security model around its data. Really complex, many, many tiers, very dynamic. It was going to be impossible to rebuild that entire security model in the data warehouse. So instead, the data warehouse had to read through the application's API so that it could enforce security on the data. So if you didn't have permission to do it in the system, you couldn't do BI reporting off of it. Business owners may hate that, but either the information is secure or it's not. And simply encrypting it in the BI warehouse isn't going to do anything. Now, can you obfuscate it? Which means use a set pattern to turn a social security number into an alphabet word so that you could then do pattern reporting? Absolutely. So Google tracks us from here to back and sells that data to anyone who will buy it, but never identifiable to us. They create codes to create the pattern, so they build a profile on us, and they use that profile to create roll-up reports that they sell. So my individual data is never compromised. Through obfuscation, they're able to sell that data in larger patterns. Or reverse target me and they say, I'm looking for everybody who has gray hair, who's speaking at a conference, and I want to send them this ad. We got 2 of them in the room right here. Retention. One person, I think, said that they've got a records retention group, retention policy. If you don't have one, think about setting it up. Thinking about introducing it as a set of standard non-functional requirements with your project and getting other people to use it. What we don't realize, and this didn't occur to me until I worked for a certain company, was keeping information can actually be more harmful than deleting it. And I love keeping everything. I have almost every single non-spam email on personal account, work account within our compliance guidelines, because I know I need to go back and prove that that stakeholder was wrong at some point in my future. But what happens if there's a class action lawsuit? What happens if there's a breach and that information is stolen? I have now dramatically increased the risk to my company. And
what happened if the stakeholder was right?
that never happens. Stakeholders are never right. If they did, they'd be part of the project team. They'd be the product. And more than anything else, whatever you do, you've got to apply it consistently. If you start applying things inconsistently, then it's very easy to make the mistake of thinking that things are okay when they're not. So let's switch again and talk about fraud and fraud management. Fraud is one of those really interesting things. So this is basically, fraud is a deliberate change that will cause the company or an individual harm. So we're not talking about accidents here, although accidents can be detected as fraud just as easily and need to be corrected. So a good fraud plan also will cover accidents and stop them from happening. So the first thing is, before you can have any sort of fraud, you've got to have a change. Because in a static system, there's no fraud because nothing's changing. A breach, access to the records that aren't authorized, is a change. You have to be aware. If you don't know, like Target, like Home Depot, that a change has occurred, you don't know that you're a victim, so you can't do anything. Next, you've got to have a consistent way of determining whether or not that change is okay. Is it valid? Is it allowed? If I make a payment through bill pay, that's a legitimate change. I am issuing a payment, it's going to be deducted from one account, it's going to go to another account. That's something I authorized, so it needs to go through. If it's not desired, then you need to take action. You've got to have a remediation process. So think about your systems. If you find out that something's wrong, who's going to take care of it? It's not the project team. You implemented. You're off in Tahiti celebrating. So who's the operational team that takes responsibility? And eventually there's got to be a resolution. In a great world, that resolution is you've stopped something before it's happened, or you've mitigated that risk. In a bad world, you settle with the credit card companies for $231 million. So with fraud analytics, you've got to consider, how am I controlling data loss? What is the data I need to correlate to determine whether or not stuff is valid? There are fraud systems you can put in place now that will actually look at social media and public records, kind of like the Equifax checks, and will build a robust model of assigning risk variables, risk percentages, based on every relationship between every piece of data you have. So you can find out that this address in your system happens to have 5 different people who claim to live there this year, and 2 of them are known fraudsters. Chances are the other 3 are as well. Data integrity, very important. How do you know that the data can be trusted? You know, that's what SOX was designed to do, is to say, if we put the checks and balances in, how do we know that we can trust the data? System access, who's accessing, what are they accessing? This is people and non-human IDs. Process IDs. Process IDs are the easiest way to abuse and bypass your system. A process ID is a system user account that allows 2 systems to talk to each other. And it works often as a username and password, which means I could potentially log in as a user using a process ID that had more permission than I'm entitled to, because as a developer in a lower environment, I had access to it, and that same process ID was used in production. I have now bypassed all your security, and I can retire in Tahiti now. And then you've got to make sure that you're monitoring activity. If you don't see what's going on, there's nothing to go by. So, a couple things to wrap up. Again, stay connected. This presentation is available online. You can download not only the direct slides, but also the guide. Feel free to distribute those. I'll have the video up possibly as early as this weekend. If not, sometimes it takes 2 weeks. All the presentations I give, all the guides I write are available on the website free of charge. Help yourself, distribute them, share. If you've got ideas, you've got feedback, please let me know. I have learned that presenting to BAs, nobody else can find typos and mistakes in your work faster than a BA, so it is appreciated. I don't take it personally. And I don't have, make sure you fill out the conference evaluation. In the book, you can also do it online. That drives these events, the speakers you get back, so please take the time to do that. The appendix in the deck also matches the appendix in here, so we've got 8 minutes remaining. So what I want to do is, I want to hear from you and find out what are some lessons, what are some things that you learned here today that you think you can apply, and how are you going to apply it? And please don't tell me I wasted an hour of your life. I'm sorry.
I think I'm going to make some efforts to reach out to other groups that I know exist, but I might not be engaging with them, and come up with some standard non-functional requirements.
How many people want to get promoted?
I'll take that.
Get a better job, more money, more fun? If you start building connections that drive enterprise value, you will find yourself in your career advancing at a much faster pace. People love people who get stuff done, especially when it's stuff that they don't want to do themselves. So definitely reaching out to teams, coming up with a set of standard requirements, non-functional, records retention, work with teams, and then share those with other project teams will really solicit yourself. Eric talked about it this morning. I talk about it a lot in how to market yourself for a better career, is that's how you differentiate yourself from the market. Because if I was looking to hire any BA, how many people are good at eliciting requirements, great at documentation, know how to do flow charts, can facilitate a meeting? Okay, everybody looks the same to me. It's what makes you unique, and that value that you really need to drive. And driving organizational value, those are success stories that will help you land much better internal or external opportunities. Yes?
So, in your business, your center of excellence, I'm not sure how to ask this question. Do you apply for every project the same level of security, or do you have a checklist or a decision matrix that says, this kind of project meets this level of security requirements written?
So yes and no. So some companies, I'll answer in general. So some companies use a project rating system where they evaluate the size and the scope of the project, and the larger or the higher risk, the more changes, the more impact, the more documentations and toll gates you would have to go through. Excellent process. I've helped use and implement security requirements. So what you do is you come up with a set of standard security requirements, and then maybe you've got a security officer or somebody to review and sit down with the project and say, these apply, these don't. Like, if you're going to store passwords and usernames, here's the rules. If you're using AD, you don't have to worry about it. You just authenticate against AD using one of our services. Records retention, pretty standard. But then you also need to have a custom review for the project. So if it's lower risk, probably in your charter and in your requirements approach, you would downgrade that a little bit. In a more complex, newer system, you would want to have more reviews, more timely reviews, definitely. So just like you're tiering risk within your application, I absolutely believe in tiering risk in your project, because we never have enough time, we never have enough money, we never have enough people. So where's the 80% of the value for 20% of the effort you're going to focus your time? Okay? Yes?
How much should the BA be involved in writing test plans and test strategies for security?
I love that question. Absolutely never.
Okay.
So I firmly believe that a business analyst and a tester are different roles. Bob on your team can play the role of a BA and can play the role of a tester. But the BA isn't writing the test plan and doing the testing. So what I would say is define them out as roles and then assign people to the roles. So yes, especially in smaller groups, the BA ends up writing some of it, but you're already biased. You're writing test cases based against your requirements. You're not writing gap requirements. You're not taking a fresh look. I actually had my developers and testers test my requirements document to go through it and challenge it and log defects for ambiguities, for requirements that weren't smart, for ones that needed to be decomposed. And so I actually use those teams as early and as fast so I could fail on paper very cheaply. All right, so we've hit the end. I'll be around today and tomorrow if you need anything to show my appreciation for participation. I want to present one of my favorite books, Lynchpin by Seth Godin. So I encourage you all to participate in
Thank you.
all of your presentations. You never know what it might lead to. If you need extra copies, please help yourself. Business cards are here. I'll have a few minutes while I'm unpacking, but I need to get out of the way for the next person, so I'm going to be walking around and doing stuff. Thank you so much for coming. I hope it was worth your hour.